So, one of my viewers suggested that I occasionally put out a sort of action-oriented video because people often, as they're listening to these philosophic ideas, will ask themselves, what can we do, or what can I do as an individual to make things a little bit better? Now, I'm kind of big on the point that we often get responsibilized for the world's problems. That's a Wendy Brown term, and I like it. In other words, we're told that if we just fix ourselves, that everything else will right itself. But that doesn't recognize the collective problem, and it's bigger than the individual. Nevertheless, there are things that we can do, and so I want to focus in on giving and receiving today, because in the United States and around the world, Christmas is a big holiday, so this brings up this theme of giving and receiving, because gift giving is often a part of it. But I don't want to concentrate so much on that kind of gift giving and receiving, actually. We do too much of it. It's kind of gross, actually. Christmas doesn't really have anything to do with tons of presents under a tree. But at its best, the message of Christmas ought to be love, and God's love, of course, and our love for each other and how we express that. And one of the ways that we express it is through giving of time and things to people, and also receiving. And today I wanted to focus on receiving, because I think for a lot of people, this is harder than giving. Why? Because in a lot of people's minds, giving is a position of power and receiving is a position of weakness. And so if we think in terms of power, it is truly better to give than to receive. Now, I want to encourage you, if you want to do something positive to change the world in your little neighborhood with the people around you, is to try to receive things graciously and to even ask for what you need. This is hard to do, but the person who cannot do that is not allowing other people to give and to be generous. And that's a part of what it means to be a good human being. So you're literally limiting other people's range of operation or scope in which they can have a positive impact on the world if you have this attitude of no. Now, in the United States, a lot of times this is a pride thing. It has to do with the person feeling as though, they either are being looked down upon from that position of power by receiving. They feel ashamed maybe because they can't give anything back, or, well, they could, but give something of equal monetary value back, because in our society, value is so tied up with monetary worth, which it shouldn't be. So they do things like they'll warn the giver, and say, let's not do any sort of giving. I don't want anything from you because I can't give anything back. All right. They'll say, don't give something to me, give it to charity. But that's a power move. That's saying that I don't need this. I've still got power. Give it to somebody who's lower than me. Okay. Whereas in reality, we're all needy. we all need other people's care and attention. We don't all need money, but that shouldn't be the main point of all of this. Lots of times an ungracious receiver will induce a guilt trip in others by emphasizing their inability to give back in the same sort of way that they've received. And so the person giving is now made to feel bad for doing so. But again, this refers back to this power imbalance, which is what we ought to work on you know, thinking in terms of money and power. A lot of people in the Midwest here think of giving in kind of transactional terms. If you give them something, they were taught by their mothers to give something of equal value back, or at least approximating it. And so I've had the experience of almost immediately, having somebody's hauled out something from their trunk because they can't just kind of enjoy receiving something. They feel guilty if they don't immediately give something back. Some people just avoid entirely situations in which they can receive or might receive, and this leads to social isolation. They don't want to be seen in that light. All right. All of this discourages generosity. So ask yourself, do you want to live in a world where people are discouraged from being generous? Or do you want to live in a world where everybody feels generous towards each other? If you want to live in the latter world, then you have to be a generous receiver. So the next time somebody offers to help you, let's say that you're living in a neighborhood and somebody notices that you're having a very hard time lifting something, or your driveway is covered in snow and you are not out there, and they offer to do it for you, say, "Thank you very much. Absolutely." And then don't feel like you have to immediately go and do something for them. Or worse yet, offer them cash. There's nothing more generosity and spirit killing in a situation like that than be treated like an employee when you're trying to do somebody a favor, just out of the generosity of your heart. So think about your own hang-ups regarding power and money and try to let them go, because the ungracious receiver who gives the person a guilt trip for trying to do something for them or give them something if they are in need is basically being ungenerous and not allowing the other person to just be generous. There will come a time when you can do something for somebody else, especially if you let go of the idea that it has to be of the same financial value. A person who has money, by the way, doesn't really care about that in that type of situation, or at least they shouldn't. Okay, there are people who do, but they shouldn't. But for the most part, giving back in some way later on down the road of value from your time, from your heart, from your spiritual resources, those are all great things to give back when you feel like it, right? But you want to avoid making the person who just did you a good turn feel bad for having done so. But now let's think about the ungracious giver. And the ungracious givers are a part of the reason why they're ungracious receivers, okay? So, some people treat giving, whether it's of their time or their wealth or gifts at Christmas, as a sort of power move. They do. And the bigger the better. They might give ostentatious gifts that are so far outside the ability of the other person to ever pay for themselves, that sort of sets it up for a feeling of like being overwhelmed or being guilty on the other person's part. And there are people who do that for the purposes of expressing just how much more they have. So if you're tempted to ever do that, or to use your giving paternalistically to kind of send the message, this is what you ought to be into, or this is what you ought to be doing, this is how you ought to be spending your time, think that through again. That's a type of aggressive giving, right? It is a power move. So, if people respond to it that way, then there's probably a reason for that. people can sometimes give with the purpose of seeking gratitude. And while it is important for a person to say thank you for having received something, it shouldn't be seen as a sort of transactional requirement. So the many grandparents who are, complaining about how grandson X or granddaughter Y never sends them a thank you, so they're going to cut them off. I mean, should they say that? Yes, they should. Maybe find a way to call your grandson or daughter and have a conversation with them and find out what they're doing with the gift that you sent, if that's what it was. Or, if you spent time with them, ask them, how did you enjoy it? And most likely what you're going to find is they're going to tell you, we loved it. All right? But young people in particular don't automatically think in these very formal terms, right? But you do hear people say, I want to be thanked. This person didn't thank me. And then again, it becomes about power. It becomes power and subservience. This is what we want to avoid. Transactional giving, where you actually expect that reciprocity to be like completely equal and immediate, that's not giving at all. And these attitudes on the part of givers also discourage genuine generosity because they are not genuinely generous themselves. I mentioned in the last video I did on Berg that I'm a believer in reciprocity, and I want to clarify now that what I don't mean by that is transactionalism. I do not mean a sort of contractual notion in which, A gives this and B gives an equal or greater amount and pays the A back, right? But rather, I want to promote the idea of partnering with others. If you live in a neighborhood or an apartment complex and somebody's done you a good turn, you look for some other point, some other time, with something that you do have, which might not be anything like what you received, but you are in a partnership with other people. Aristotle's category of friendship is so important here. It's not a liberal category, okay? All of these power attitudes and transactional ways of thinking, they're liberal in nature. They're imbued in us through capitalism. But there's a great deal of life that should be beyond liberal transactionalism. Neighborliness, community, friendship, these are forms of friendship. They should be beyond that. Here's a quote from Aristotle. He says, between friends, there is no need for justice. Justice is that strict, equality, in this case of giving. Between friends, there is no need for justice, but people who are just still need the quality of friendship to be human. Otherwise, we would just be computers making transactions. And indeed, friendliness, he says, is considered to be justice in the fullest sense. All right, because it is a form of love. So I would challenge you especially to be a gracious receiver, to enjoy and even ask for the help of others, and to not feel guilty, and to don't make them feel guilty. And you will have sent out into the world a positive message that generosity is good and needed and rewarded. And ideally, that's what this holiday season should be about. See you next week.